I would love to have Daemon Targaryen on this podcast. Woo!
Oh, imagine.
Even though I know he's a psycho, but there's something about it that's just attractive. Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I 100%
like
the first time I watched this, I was like,
yes, like
questionable behavior, but welcome back to the Booked on Fantasy podcast. We are two best friends who love all things fantasy. On this podcast, we will explore the world of fantasy through books, shows, and movies, but with a heavy emphasis on books. We are continuing right along with our dragon coverage, and today we are talking all about House of the Dragon Season 1, Episode 2. The purpose of our House of the Dragon episodes is to recap and analyze all of Season 1 in preparation for the release of Season 2. Season 2 is set to release June 16th, so we will be posting one episode each week dedicated to each episode in Season 1 of House of the Dragon. It is definitely getting much more intense. That tension is just building, even just 2 episodes in, but obviously we have a pretty major catalyst event occur in this episode, I think, so I cannot wait for us to just dive right in and start talking about it. But of course, as a quick reminder, we will be discussing everything from the first episode of House of the Dragon Season 1. We may point to other events that happen in other episodes as well, because this is a TV series that both Addison and I have watched previously. If you have not watched House of the Dragon, truly it is such an amazing show. So pause here, go watch it, and then come back and listen so you can analyze with us. Furthermore, we would like to remind everyone that this is an adult podcast where we will have explicit conversations. Explicit language may be used, so please be mindful of that and maybe put on some headphones first. As far as housekeeping goes, we are continuing our episodes of Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass series. When this episode comes out, we have released 3 episodes for Throne of Glass, which cover chapters 1 through 22. So you've got plenty of content to keep you entertained. Whether you're a seasoned reader and want to refresh your memory, or you are brand new to the series like us, then those episodes are right there waiting for you. So definitely go check those out if you are a fantasy book lover. All right, so let's get this episode started. Our House of the Dragon episodes will likely be on the shorter side, but of course, no promises on that. Each of these episodes will consist of a recap of the key events, followed by an analysis where we pick apart notable conversations, events, or other observations. Then we will have a mini trial in the fantasy court of law to decide which team has enough evidence to support their claim to the Iron Throne. And then, of course, last but not least, we will also share our favorite moments from the episode. And now, Addison, please take it away with our episode recap.
Thank you, Lorraine. We kick off the episode with a gruesome scene of men being eaten alive by crabs in what looks to be the aftermath of a battle. Cue New Fear unlocked. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard dies off screen and a replacement is needed. In an effort to distract Rhaenyra from getting involved in actual problems facing the realm, they let her decide who the replacement should be, and she picks Sir Criston Cole. Meanwhile, Lord Corlys is angry that several of his ships and men have been lost in the Stepzone and wants the king to use a show of force to put a stop to it. The king refuses. Lord Corlys uses the situation to leverage a favorable marriage between Viserys and his very, and I mean very, young daughter, Lady Laena. Viserys and Alicent have a brief conversation in which he implores her not to tell Rhaenyra about their talks for fear she wouldn't understand. Later on, Alicent and Rhaenyra share a heartfelt moment in the Sept where they talk about their mothers and Rhaenyra shows some vulnerability. And we're back to the king, and he has more weird festering wounds, this time on his finger, while being treated with maggots. Ew. He discusses Lord Corlys' proposal with the council members. Princess Rhaenys and Rhaenyra have a tension-filled conversation where Rhaenys gives her the 411 and how the world works and tells her she doesn't understand the order of things, and Viserys will likely remarry, produce heirs, and replace her as heir to the Iron Throne. Simultaneously, Daemon starts his shenanigans. He steals a dragon egg for his supposed baby on the way and announces he will be taking a second wife. Otto Hightower goes to Dragonstone to deal with Daemon, and tensions almost bubble over into bloodshed, but our girl Rhaenyra flies in on Syrax and saves the day. Plot twist! Turns out Daemon's mistress isn't pregnant, and in fact, she doesn't want to marry him. Viserys is mad Rhaenyra left without permission, but it does prompt a heart-to-heart where they speak plainly, and Rhaenyra accepts that the king will remarry. Finally, at the end of our episode, King Viserys announces that he will remarry. However, he's going to marry Lady Alicent Hightower. both Lord Corlys and Rhaenyra are pissed. And we see Lord Corlys and Daemon attempting to ally together against the king. All right, so one quick thing I forgot to note in our first episode of House of the Dragon is the title of each episode. Episode 1, the title was The Heirs of the Dragon, and it makes sense given all of the different groups that play and the storyline about Queen Aemma and Baelon. I always like to look out for those because a lot of times they're funny or they're just very telling about what's going on in the episode. So this episode is called The Rogue Prince. This title is in reference to Daemon because he is still a prince and he's a rogue. And so I actually looked at the definition of rogue just because I feel like I used that word, but if you actually asked me what it meant, I'm not sure I could tell you. So the definition of rogue is a dishonest or unprincipled person. And I feel like that describes Daemon pretty accurately. So calling him the Rogue Prince, I feel like is a very fitting title for him.
That's funny. Dishonest or unprincipled. I feel like people use, like when you go rogue, I just always interpret it to mean you're just going off the traditional path or something, or like you're taking matters into your own hands. But this one definitely is a little more negative. He's definitely unprincipled for sure, and dishonest in this case too, because he's lying to so many people about why he's doing what he's doing and all these things. So,
Hence the constant debate in my head, is he a shadow daddy? Is he a morally gray man, or is he just a bad guy? I don't know. I can't tell.
I mean, he's definitely bad. There's no other way to say like what he does. But when you analyze his character, then it does make you understand his motivations. And then it's a little less like you're just straight up bad. But I mean, no question, he definitely does bad things. So.
I mean, he hasn't done anything bad yet. So our episode kicks off and all of the King's Council are assembled and they're talking about things in the realm, and Lord Corlys storms in and he's very angry because 4 ships have been lost in the Stepstones, including some that were under his banner, and he wants the king to act. But Viserys, as usual, is very passive in his response. He says he doesn't want to start a war with the Free Cities and that he's sent envoys to come to a peaceful resolution to whatever is going on. So I thought, first of all, his response is very telling of his leadership style. First of all, Lord Corlys comes in kind of hot and disrespectful, and the king is just like, whatever, just takes it. And second, he doesn't actually want to engage in any kind of meaningful conflict. Lord Corlys also mentions the Crab Feeder, who is a notorious pirate who repeatedly raids ships. And so I did some research because I was pretty sure I knew what and where the Stepstones were and why they were important, but I did actually verify this. So the Stepstones are a chain of islands between the southern Narrow Sea and the northwestern Summer Sea. In and of themselves, they are actually just a small chain of rocky islands, which are totally worthless. They're literal rocks you can stand on, basically. Nothing grows there. There's no resources there. The major sea lanes between the Narrow Sea and the Summer Sea have to pass through the straits between the Stepstones, which make them strategically very important. All of the sea trade to the east coast of Westeros and 5 out of the 9 free cities have to pass through the Stepstones to reach other major markets in the world. So basically, it's essentially an extremely vital economic shipping lanes, right? So they need access to these in order to get goods. So that's why Lord Corlys is so mad. And also, I think, feels that it's very important that we address the issue, because there's real world implications that could impact the people of Westeros.
Yeah, Corlys, which he said this specifically at the end, if those shipping lanes fall, my house will be crippled and I will not have Driftmark beggared while the king idles and feasts and balls, and basically it doesn't do anything about this. Of course, it's bad for Corlys, so he has a particularly vested interest. But yeah, given its relationship as a lane for trade between all cities within Westeros and within the realm, it would be really bad for that to be overtaken.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's not just that it impacts Lord Corlys economically. He also has the most powerful navy in the realm, right? He is vital to the defenses of Westeros. If those shipping lanes are compromised, it impacts his navy's mobility. And so I think that's another reason that Viserys should take it more seriously, right? Because it's not just that you have a huge economic impact, but also a defensive position is compromised if the Stepstones are continually attacked.
Yeah, it's both an economic and security issue.
Security. Yeah.
for them, which I thought it was interesting that the only counterpoint that they had to this is that nobody has engaged in open war against a free city. The council is like, no one's tried to ever attack a free city, so we're not going to do that and instigate a war. And I was like, they've already declared war. That was an aggressive attack. Not war per se, that's probably a little bit of a strong term, but they made the first attack.
I think they're concerned. My understanding of the situation is that it's not really the free cities attacking the ships, it's pirates in the area, like the Crab Feeder, who we know is going to become more important villain later. But if they were to, I guess, show a big military force in the Stepstones, it could be perceived as them trying to expand their realm of influence over that area. If you move your military too close, they get nervous and they're like, why do you have this big army here? It could be seen as an act of aggression or an attempt at invasion. So I think that's more their concern on why they don't want to engage with force, was my reading of the conversation.
That makes sense.
The other secondary issue of that conversation that became important is Rhaenyra is in the room when this conversation is happening, and she overhears this conversation, and she looks at Viserys when he's like, we're not gonna use a show of force, and she goes, but we have dragon riders, we could use them. And then the king and Otto Hightower give each other a look, and she's like, it would be a show of force, and they're like, why don't you go do something, useful? And I thought that was really interesting because that's, I thought, really the first time that you highlight a clear division in what will probably be their ruling styles. Rhaenyra's like, baby, we got dragons. Let's go. And Viserys just like, no, it's all about diplomacy. And I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, take those dragons and fuck that shit up. But
why do you have dragons if you're not going to use them?
Okay, thank you. I'm not saying you should just go all dragon out every little conflict. But at this point, take that dragon, go, set everything on fire and be done with it, right? But that's not what Viserys does.
I agree. And to that point, Rhaenyra has been named an heir. She should be partaking in these council meetings now and understanding what's going on, how to make strategic decisions as the ruler of Westeros. But they do this several times. Viserys specifically does this a lot, and the council kind of too doesn't really take her very seriously either. But they're always so dismissive towards all of her ideas, even though what she is suggesting is a fan-fucking-tastic idea. I'm like, you're so right. Mm-hmm. Go take care of this problem before it becomes a larger issue while it's still small and manageable. You know, don't just let it fester and eventually grow into the bigger problem that it does become,
Yes. So I have two things to say about that. The first is, you're absolutely right. She is the future ruler of Westeros. So she should be basically in queen training, like all the council meetings. She should be an active participant. And that would be a really good way for Viserys to take her under his wing. And if he did want to train her to be a more thoughtful, considerate ruler and not be quick to jump to violent action, then why don't you have a conversation with her about that, right? And the other thing I thought was notable about that scene is that it's been 6 months since Rhaenyra has been named heir to the throne. Why is she still filling their cups? Why is she still the cupbearer? All these old, gross men, and she's in there filling their drink cups. I'm like, that is the future fucking queen of Westeros, and she's filling your cups? I was very angered by that because I'm like, what the fuck? And it makes me feel like everyone in that room doesn't take her seriously as the literal future ruler. I don't know. That actually really annoyed me.
Rhaenys made that same exact point, which we'll get to that conversation later between Rhaenys and Rhaenyra. But that's exactly what Rhaenys said. And she's like, you're named heir, but here you are, just filling cups, being dismissed. You will never be taken seriously.
Yeah. I will say in that conversation, I do feel Rhaenys is a little biased. I have some thoughts about that. So we'll talk about that a little later. But the last thing I wanted to say about this conversation about Viserys' decision regarding the Stepstones is later in a conversation with Lord Corlys. Corlys apologizes. He said, I'm sorry I came in so hot. I'm just really worried about this. And Corlys sort of like dresses down the king. He's like, this and this, and there's this issue. And the king's like, wow, you're really painting me a good look for how I'm running the kingdom. But the king says something that I thought was really interesting. He says, as a king, it is my obligation to avoid war until such time it is unavoidable. And so at first, when you hear that statement, you're like, yeah, a good ruler tries to avoid conflict, right? Conflict is expensive. People lose their lives. Women are widowed. Children are orphaned, right? It's not a good thing. But I think it shows his lack of strategic vision because in reality, there is a difference in using a show of force and starting a war, right? And Viserys engaging and reacting in a show of force in the Stepstones is not necessarily starting a war. It's just saying, hey, you can't take our ships and our money and shit because it belongs to us. And in reality, his inaction is more likely to cause a war in the future because at some point the tension spills over so greatly that you have no choice but to retaliate. And so in a way, I feel like that almost shows his lack of strategic thinking and foresight, and that he's conflating being forceful and assertive with just being violent and starting a war. And so I thought that was really interesting.
You know, somebody had made a comment on our TikTok account. So thank you to the person that commented because we love to hear people's thoughts. And they were saying Viserys is really a peaceful king. And I was like, yes, that's true. Viserys is a peaceful king. And I agree that peace in general is a good thing. It's a time of prosperity for places. But Viserys in particular is peaceful and passive.
Yes.
He actively does not make decisions and take action when it's necessary under this guise that I'm trying not to start a war. But it's like, no, these pirates have come in, taken your property. What does that show to the rest of the realm and to other cities if you have a little pirate group coming in here stealing your shit and you don't do anything about it?
You're sounding a lot like Lord Corlys right now, Lorraine.
I know, I am.
That's exactly what Lord But I mean, is he wrong? No, I don't think so. I think he's absolutely right.
I 100% agree with him.
Yeah, it's not just the resources being destroyed. It's also the perception to all the other free cities, other players in the universe that, hey, like, you just come take our shit and we're not going to do anything about it. You know? Like,
yeah.
Why not? And then the last thing that I wanted to say about this exchange and this whole conversation about engaging in the Stepstones, I'm going to give a weird parallel, but just roll with me. In the Hunger Games, spoilers if you haven't finished it, that was a long time ago, so get with the program. But at the end of the Hunger Games, rebels have won, they've taken over the Capitol, and President Coin, she's like, we're going to have a Hunger Games with the Capitol's children, okay? And her justification and her reasoning is that the rebel population is there's so much momentum and there's so much appetite for revenge and bloodlust and violence that she needs to do something to release the tension, or we could have yet another uprising. Chaos breeds chaos, right? And so her argument is that we need an outlet for those kind of things, okay? So I feel it's a very similar parallel for what's happening in Westeros, right? It's been, I think in the first episode you mentioned it, like in that conversation with Corlys and Princess Rhaenys, it's been 70 years since any of the knights have seen combat, okay? So you've got all these very young men. They want to prove themselves. They're unseasoned. You know, all they do is fight in tournaments, right? And at some point, you need an outlet for that kind of, I hate to say this kind of male energy, you know, this sort of violent energy that's, I mean, because think about it, in this universe, all of these men are trained to be fighters and knights and shit. Their entire existence is like a real man fights and protects, right? And so I feel like you could use things like this as a way to, one, train your actual soldiers, your knights, okay? And two, you could use it to release some pent up violent energy because it's never done. Well, then you already set the tone for all these young men who are ready to prove themselves. They kind of want a conflict. They want something to happen, right? It's a very common trope, especially in fantasy, when there's a military. They're like, we got to keep the military moving. If there's not a battle soon enough, they get bored. You got to keep the momentum going. That was just another thought I had too, that it's a way Viserys could strategically manage his military assets. And instead he's just like, no, everyone just eat cake and I don't know, just chill.
Be happy.
You know,
be
happy.
Yeah. Exactly. We're just vibes only. We're chilling and vibes. Just kidding. That's not what we want. But this is actually a perfect segue into Rhaenyra. I think Rhaenyra recognizes that. She definitely can tell that, hey, you can't ignore these things at some point you need to take action, because right after that, they basically just usher her out. Hightower is like, let's go take you to go look at some guards. And immediately she strategically is thinking about what is the actual real world experience that these knights have. You're presenting me with all these people who've never fought in combat before. And she literally asks, do any of these knights have combat experience beyond capturing poachers?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm like, you're so right, because why are you asking about knights and guards whose role is to defend and protect? And yet most of these knights have never defended and protected anything in a real world sense other than Sir Criston Cole, and that's who she chooses.
No, I totally agree. I also love in that scene that she's standing on the step stool. Like, so she looks taller. And then at the end when she just hops off of it, I thought that was really funny.
Yeah. But interestingly, that also was another point to show how Rhaenyra is undermined, because obviously Hightower is questioning her choices. I forget exactly what he said, but he definitely questions Rhaenyra's choice. But I think he recognizes that Rhaenyra is capable of ruling, and obviously feels threatened by that because it interferes with his greater plans of trying to align his house and marriage with the Targaryens. And if Rhaenyra proves to be somebody who's worthy of ruling, and that if the council eventually ends up rallying behind her, then he doesn't have an outlet to come in.
I think it's definitely safe to say that Hightower is definitely unsure about what his house's position would be under another ruler, right? At this time, I don't think Rhaenyra necessarily dislikes Hightower. I mean, she's pretty young, and that is her best friend's dad. I think it's definitely fair to say this is kind of the first time where he's like, maybe my position won't be secure if she actually were to ascend the throne. And so he feels he needs to assert some dominance to try to make himself useful in a potential future scenario.
I agree that Rhaenyra probably doesn't dislike Hightower at this point, but I do think that she knows that he's not always making great decisions either, particularly when she goes to Dragonstone and she comes back and she's talking to Viserys, and he's talking about like, why did you do that? You disobeyed me. And she's like, I retrieved the egg without bloodshed, a feat I'm not sure Otto could have accomplished alone.
That's true. I think you're right at this point. She's old enough. She's been around enough. She does have some awareness about how things are going in the King's Council and the realm. Yeah, I would agree with that. So we had to talk about the scene where Alicent and Rhaenyra go to the Sept, and that is the weird dark room with all the candles. When they say Sept, I'm assuming that's kind of like a church or a prayer room, so to speak. But they go in there, and Rhaenyra is complaining about her father and the council, and they're like, oh, he'll remarry. And Alicent responds to her and she says, but what if your father were to remarry? So when she says that, the first thing when I was watching it, I was like, is she saying that as like, because she's a good friend and she knows that's probably going to happen at some point, and she's trying to help Rhaenyra process at some point this might happen, right? Or she's saying that because in the back of her mind, she thinks that she may marry Viserys. So at first I was like, maybe. By the end of the episode, I do not think that is the case. I do not think that was a loaded question or her sort of trying to test the waters of, oh, maybe I'll marry Viserys. I have a relatively well-developed reason why, which we'll talk about towards the end of the episode, but I did just want to put that in the back of your mind. Why is Alicent asking that question? And I do think it's an innocent question. I don't think she's asking in a sort of plotting or manipulative way. And then the other thing, I just thought it was nice that they had a heartfelt moment. That's one of the saddest things to me about this whole conflict, is that Alicent and Rhaenyra were such good friends. They're childhood friends, right? And they both lost their mothers, and really all they have is each other. And it's nice to see their friendship, but ultimately it's also heartbreaking because, you know, the dissolution of their friendship is forthcoming. And it's just really sad to see those moments because they're so close and you're like, it's so nice they have each other. And then it all, you know, falls apart.
I agree with you in that I don't know that Alicent was intentionally trying to be malicious in asking that question, but I do think that she was asking it knowing that her father has put her in a position to become close with Viserys. Because these things are happening congruently. So on one hand, she is trying to be a good friend and comfort her. Alicent is thinking about how she had to approach Hightower, how she had to re-engage in conversation. And she said, when I must talk with him, I know that I must make the effort. And so she's kind of also simultaneously acting as an in-between between her conversations with Viserys as well, because she knows that Viserys is upset about the distance that has been felt between him and his daughter, but she's also friends with Rhaenyra, and she's attempting to try to repair the bond between both of them too. And that's a really hard position to be in. And I feel really bad for Alicent. I think I've definitely come to realize that, none of this was ever anything that she wanted. Two things can be true at the same time. She wants to be friends with Rhaenyra and help her, but she also is locked into this expectation. And it's just hard. It's a hard position to be in. I wouldn't want to be there. And I don't know what I would do if I was her either. So
Same, absolutely. I can't even imagine. And to be so young, too. I mean,
yeah.
she's 14, 15. I was still learning how to put on mascara when I was 14. You know what I mean? Like, I was still trying not to draw my eyeliner. Like,
I know, not sitting there
like,
comforting and talking to a 50-something-year-old man. I don't know how old Viserys is, but I do feel really bad for her for sure. So moving along in this episode timeline, the next prominent conversation that happens is the one between Rhaenys and Rhaenyra, which this is also all under this context of knowing that Corlys wants his house to be married with the Targaryens, obviously from a strategic position for him personally, but in general as an option for whom Viserys has a duty to marry in this larger context, which we have more specific thoughts about Corlys coming up. But to focus in on Rhaenys and Rhaenyra is observing Viserys walk and talk with 12-year-old Laena, which is just that visual is really weird to watch because way too young. I mean, they're all too young for any of this, but it was just particularly apparent with Laena.
Oh, yeah. At least with Alicent and Rhaenyra, they're still underage. So I'm just speaking in the context of the times. They're closer to womanhood. But Lady Laena, she is a child. There's no way, no matter how you dress her up, that is a child. And she's just so short and tiny. Oh my gosh.
So small. Anyways, so as they're observing, Rhaenys and Rhaenyra start to have a conversation about duty. And basically she starts it off with, "Are you okay with this?" to Rhaenys. And Rhaenys is like, "No, but I understand the order of things." So it's very clear that Rhaenys does not approve that the men, traditionally speaking, are the ones to determine the house lineage and the royal line. But she's more or less accepted that it is what it is and there's nothing to be done. So Rhaenys has essentially become or feels spited because she's gone through this process before. She's dubbed the queen who never was. They just passed her over. She's watched this story play out before for her specifically. And Rhaenyra says, "Well, they denied you," in reference to that council's decision against appointing her as heir. Rhaenys believes that Rhaenyra is very naive, and she's trying to give her this reality check that men are not going to allow women to rule the Iron Throne. Just fundamentally, they are not going to do that. And then she even says they would rather destroy the realm than allow that to happen.
I actually had that exact quote. She says, "Men would rather put the realm to the torch than see a woman ascend the throne." Mm-hmm. Like they would literally rather burn it to the ground, which is some really strong words, right? I will say in this conversation, I kind of went back and forth because on the one hand, I feel like she's a little bitter. Her personal bias is coloring this conversation, right? Mm-hmm. How could she not be bitter, right? Rhaenyra is essentially what she wanted to be, is the living embodiment of that. Mm-hmm. But also, I do think that there's a lot of truth into what she's saying. And especially in that conversation when she says, "It's likely your father will remarry and bear heirs. And at that point, the statistical odds are in his favor that one of them will be male, and they're going to pass you right over." And so it's hard just to point and say, well, she's just saying that because she's bitter, because I do think that she's right. And we see this exact scenario come true. And hence the entire plot of the show.
I think that that's very true. Rhaenyra is an heir, but we see several instances of her being totally dismissed despite having good ideas. We also see the reoccurring conversations between the council and council members and Viserys about Viserys's need to marry and produce an heir. Even though he has an heir, he's named an heir, but they're like, no, we're not talking about her.
But
like,
she's not a boy. She's
right.
not
To everybody
a boy.
else,
That's the
Rhaenyra
problem.
is temporary.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And-
She's a placeholder. So one of the next scenes that comes up is Alicent and the king are sitting down. They're talking. The king is telling her about the proposal that Lord Corlys has made for him to marry his very, very young daughter, Lady Laena. And Alicent gives him a gift, a little stone dragon for Viserys' little city, which I thought was very thoughtful. But when they're talking about the marriage proposal, there's a very subtle, quick shot of Alicent picking at her nails. And I'm going to point this out probably every episode because this is a very common theme throughout the rest of the show. And it indicates her unease and anxiety about the situation. And so during this scene, I had to ask myself, does she like the king romantically? Because you see that they've obviously developed a close and personal relationship. So at first I was on the fence, but I do not think so. And I have a couple reasons why. So the first is, I think in general, the conversation about marriage makes her uneasy because she feels maybe it's not appropriate for her to be discussing that with him. And the physical manifestation of that anxiety is her picking at her nails. The second thing, and when I had this thought, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Alicent's mother passed away, okay? And she saw her father go through the same thing when she lost her mother and he lost his wife. And so I think Alicent is just fulfilling the same rule that she has done in the past. And so I really do think that she's genuinely there just to support the king and sort of, guide him through his grief because she's already done that with her own father and she lost her mother. So she's an ideal candidate for this because she understands Rhaenyra's perspective. And I think she understands Viserys' perspective a little bit too because she saw her father go through it. And we see her do this exact same thing for Rhaenyra when they're in the sect and Alicent is praying and she tells Rhaenyra, this is how I feel close to my mom, you should try it. And so she's fulfilling those roles for both of them. She's trying to be a good friend and thoughtful person to help someone who's gone through something really traumatic that she herself has experience in. And so I think all of that points to the fact that Alicent is really innocent in this and she's not there in any kind of scheming or manipulative way to get the king's hand in marriage.
Yeah, I don't believe that Alicent ever wanted to do this. I don't think she ever has had attraction to the king. It's purely out of duty and she's being forced to by Hightower and she doesn't have a say in it really. So she kind of accepts that and then plays the role accordingly, I think.
Agreed. All right. So we have to talk about Daemon Targaryen's fuckery. What is he doing? He steals an egg for his future baby's cradle. He announces he's taking a second wife and that he is now taking over Dragonstone. I have many thoughts about this, but Lorena, I want to hear your thoughts. So just tell me everything you think.
My first thought was like, what is he doing? Why is he doing this?
And why?
He specifically took Dreambuyer's egg, and that was the egg that was supposed to be granted to Balon. He was trying to dig in deep with that one, which he obviously did.
And really fucked up.
Yeah, it 100% was that he did that. But to give an overview of the situation, they go and confront him. Hightower and some of the guards do it initially. In the conversation between Daemon and Hightower, he says, "You never survived this." And then Daemon responds back to Hightower, "Well, happily, neither would you." And I feel like this was kind of my first inkling that Daemon's just making a move, basically a cry for attention in a way, and purely out of spite. He's not doing this because he's really that serious about the egg or Lady Mysaria, his
And the council's word, it's Daemon's whore.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll call her his mistress. That seems a little more.
Yeah, his mistress, I guess. Yeah, to be a little nicer about the situation. He's not serious about any of this. He's just trying to make a move and cause a scene. And he's basically just throwing a tantrum, but would gladly, if it allows him to take out Hightower in the process, that's fine with him. If that's the only thing he accomplishes from this situation, in my opinion, I feel like that's what he was kind of going for. A, get Viserys' attention. B, maybe in the conflict, if I can get rid of Hightower, because we know that Daemon hates Hightower. He does not trust him. He doesn't want him involved whatsoever. And so if he can get him out of there by having this little battle take place over this egg and just eliminate him.
Yeah.
But anyways,
thought about that. Because like when this all has happened, I'm like, what is the strategic purpose of this? What is Daemon trying to get? But I think your analysis is right. He's just fucking with the king, and maybe on the off chance he can get rid of Hightower.
Right. Like, he's just been very pissed about the situation. And obviously we see that again because now Rhaenyra comes in on Syrax like a badass, which I was like,
Woo!
yes. I loved that scene so much when she came in.
Hell
But
yeah.
and she arrives and she challenges Daemon to kill her. She's like, I'm right here. The reason that you were disinherited, if you wish to be restored as heir, you'll need to kill me. So do it and be done with all this bother. And she exposes his fib because through their conversation also, he's like, we don't have a baby now, but we could. And so I stole the egg for the possibility of it, you know? Who are you to say this is not legitimate? And she's like, no, it's not. Clearly, you're just trying to piss everybody off. But to me, it was interesting that Daemon doesn't kill Rhaenyra because he could, if he wanted to, he could have. And obviously, it would have caused problems, but it would have immediately solidified his place because he would be next in line. But he didn't do that. True. Instead, he listens to Rhaenyra. And as mad as he is, he walks away. And I think that's when I realized at its core, this is about Daemon being upset about his relationship with Viserys and that Viserys doesn't trust him. Viserys doesn't include him in the process at all.
I do absolutely agree with your analysis that he's mostly throwing a temper tantrum. There is one other thing, though, that I think specifically in regards to Rhaenyra, I think part of the reason it's because Daemon knows that she's a good candidate for marriage and that if she does ascend the throne, he can easily marry her and also basically put himself on the throne because we know that Targaryens marry each other. Mm-hmm. That's canon, right? And so I think part of it is that Daemon knows that Rhaenyra could potentially be his wife. And so it's still strategically beneficial to him to have Rhaenyra around and keep her alive.
Mm-hmm. Well, we see that the relationship gets closer, but even in the very beginning, it's really close. It really caught me off guard at first, but even before that, back in the first episode, we know that they have a unique relationship. I don't know how to explain it, but I think that Daemon respects her because he sees her as somebody who is willing to take action. She stands her ground. She's not afraid to confront realities, which is opposite of what Viserys does. And so I do believe that there's a level of respect. So he's willing to listen to Rhaenyra in a way that he won't listen to other people. And of course, do I think at this particular time he necessarily perceives her as a candidate for marriage and as a love interest? No.
To be clear, I don't think Daemon loves her, wants to think about her in a romantic way. I think it's purely strategic on his part. So probably the biggest reveal of this episode is that King Viserys announces that he will remarry, but he will not be marrying Lady Laena. He, in fact, will be marrying Alicent Hightower, which, hello, mic drop. Who saw that coming? Obviously we did. But, at the time, you're like, holy shit, that was really unexpected. And there's a couple reasons why I think it's unexpected. First of all, it doesn't make any goddamn sense. Strategically, why would the king be marrying Alicent Hightower? As far as I know, the Hightowers are not a particularly powerful house. They don't have big military or a lot of money. And then the second is that in reality, Lady Laena is a perfect match for Viserys, right? She is the daughter of Lord Corlys. She has Targaryen blood. She's from one of the oldest houses of Valyria. Her father has a huge navy. It really is the perfect way to ally these two houses strategically. The only issue with the marriage is that she's very young. And when I say issue, I'm talking about in this universe, obviously not in the real world. In the real world, that would be...
that would just be... Yeah, that's...
It would be a huge problem.
Yeah.
When speaking in the House of the Dragon universe, the only problem is that she's very young. She's only 12 years old.
Yeah.
And I do think, I will say to Viserys' credit, that does give him some pause. Even he's like, you're really young. You're really young.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is echoed in that conversation with the member of the King's Council.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was going to say prior to that, I was surprised when I first watched this episode for the very first time. I was like, wait, what? Alicent. But then it actually makes sense because this conversation that he has with one of his councilmen, we can't remember his name, but Viserys basically states that he does not trust Corlys. He's having a conversation, and he says, Corlys Valerian's envious gaze staring at me. And he takes note of the fact that Corlys is, on his part, making a very strategic move for his house by suggesting Viserys marry his daughter Laena, which that's a fair point. But I'm also kind of simultaneous, like, okay, Viserys, if you're going to notice that, then how did you not notice that Hightower's doing the same thing with Alicent? That was my thing. What do you mean? You can recognize that Corlys, who actually has a fair point in suggesting, because he's the master of ships. They're a very wealthy family. Laena is part Targaryen. It all just makes sense for them to merge their houses, other than the fact that Laena is 12 and very young, which is Viserys' only argument against it, by the way. He doesn't have a very valid point for why he wouldn't do that, other than his just general opinions that he doesn't want to marry Laena. But even his councilman advises him, because he's like, I want your unencumbered opinion. And the councilman's like, Lord Corlys is your master of ships. She's the eldest daughter of the wealthiest house. You should marry her. If you have this duty that you have to fulfill no matter what, your best option, strategically speaking, is to marry Laena, because she actually adds strength to his position as a ruler of the Iron Throne. And then the councilman also states that if he's not going to choose Laena Valerian, then Corlys is not going to be satisfied unless, he says, quote, nothing short of a direct bloodline would satisfy him, and we find ourselves on the precipice of war in the Stepstones. But actually, from an heir's perspective, though, it probably does make sense to choose Alicent, because Alicent can get pregnant right away, which Laena is 12 and she has to wait 2 years.
That's true.
Right.
That's
and
true.
she even
At
says
least.
that in their conversation between Laena on their little walk. He's like,
what'd your mom say?
What'd your mom say? And she's like, well, she told me I wouldn't have to bed you until I'm 14.
I know. I actually had that in my notes. Why does he choose Alicent? And I think he actually likes Alicent. She's pretty and thoughtful and kind. I think it is genuine. I think she is interested in what Viserys says. And I think ultimately Viserys finally has someone who cares for him that doesn't have an ulterior motive.
I do agree that Alicent is genuinely a very kind, mature, caring person. And Viserys happens to respond more to that.
I think Viserys likes that she doesn't want anything from him. She doesn't have an ulterior motive. Obviously, you're absolutely right. Otto Hightower is using Alicent as a pawn, but from Viserys' perspective, Alicent is just there for him. You know, I think he likes that.
So there was one little thing that I thought was kind of nice between Rhaenyra and Viserys. When Rhaenyra returns from Dragonstone, obviously Viserys is very upset. He's like, you are my only heir. You could have been killed. It was an important moment for them because they finally are having this conversation and acknowledging their shared grief with each other over Aemma's passing and Balon's passing as well, but also explicitly stating to each other that they understand what their respective roles are and that the king has a duty to remarry, and Rhaenyra knows that. Although Rhaenyra, at this particular point in time, I think obviously thinks that Viserys is going to marry Laena.
Yes,
because she's been witnessing all this. I think everybody did, to the point of like it being a complete and utter surprise that Alicent was chosen. And then something just kind of ironic. In general, I think it's pretty clear that Viserys is not fit to be king, but we're just piling up the evidence against this and how he initiates so many problems. He is the source of all the issues that cause this, that are present in this show. But he says to her at the end, I do not wish for us to be estranged. And then why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you marrying Rhaenyra's best friend? What did you think was going to happen? You know?
Yeah.
He's an idiot.
All right. And then we jump into the final scene of the episode, and the final scene of our analysis here is where the very brief conversation that Daemon and Lord Corlys have at the end, where they decide that they are going to team up. Lord Corlys is greatly angered by the fact that Viserys is not going to marry Lady Laena, and in fact is going to marry Alicent Hightower. I think his immediate reaction is, if I can't get to the throne this way, I'll get to it another way, and I'll use Daemon Targaryen. What a formidable pair, those two.
I thought that was very strategic on Corliss's part. All right. It is now time for our Fantasy Court of Law segment. So we're going to present some evidence to build the case of Team Green and Team Black. And yeah, then we'll leave it up to everybody in the comments. Have at it. Let us know. Add your evidence as expert witnesses, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, Addison, let's get to it.
All right. So again, Team Green will be pretty short in this episode as well. There basically is no Team Green yet. However, the king does announce that he will marry Alicent Hightower, and this sets the foundation for all the events that transpire and having a real Team Green in future episodes. The only small kind of note that I had that points in the direction of Team Green is we cannot ignore the conversation between Rhaenys and Rhaenyra when she says that you don't know the order of things, and she breaks it down for her that the king will remarry and produce heirs because it's his duty to the realm. And likely some of those heirs will be male. And once they have a male heir that is past infancy, that Rhaenyra will be pushed aside. Lorraine, you talked about this in the first episode, that tradition and history is really the foundation of what Team Green is on. And I'm just going to say this now so we don't have to say it every freaking episode. In modern times, women can rule. Huzzah! Yes, women can rule. Yeah. In the context of this show, it is highly, highly important that Rhaenyra is a woman, and that women have never ruled, and that women are not seen as fit for ruling, okay? And so that is going to be a lot of the foundation of Team Green, and we just need to accept that in this universe, that is extremely important, okay? Obviously, We all disagree. We think women should be in power and all that good stuff, but for this show, we have to think about it like that.
Yes. I agree with the evidence for Team Green so far.
So for Team Black, same thing. Not much in this section has changed. Rhaenyra is still the active heir. She's the only living child of King Viserys. The only other additional point that I added for my Team Black evidence is in the conversation that Rhaenyra and the king have at the end of the episode. He tells her that he has to remarry, and she says she understands. He says that she's his only heir and that the line is vulnerable and too easy ended. But the important part of this is that he even says, but I have no intent of replacing you as heir. Actually, I have the direct quote. The direct quote is, I could never replace your mother, no more than I intend to replace you as heir. So that is just a little bit of evidence to support Team Black, because it shows Viserys' intent is that even though he knows he has to remarry, that he does not intend to replace Rhaenyra, that he does want her to maintain her position as heir to the Iron Throne. So just a little bit of evidence to support Rhaenyra's claim.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I guess I'm just playing devil's advocate today. So
apparently you're spicy today.
So the only thing, and I say this because it's really important in the future episodes. So obviously these conversations that Viserys has with Rhaenyra are always private. Nobody else is there. It's only between the two of them. And as we know, this becomes a he said, she said issue and is totally up into a misinterpretation. And if there's no documentation or verification by anybody else outside of Rhaenyra to say, no, this was Viserys' intent, then of course it leaves the door open for others to come in and say, that's not what he meant. That's not what he was supposed to do. That's not what he intended to do. As we see happens in misinterpretations of dreams later on. And not dreams, but just conversations between characters, things happening in private. Nobody else is there to verify. He said, she said. So
if only he just would have said it in front of everybody.
For reals. All right. We are coming to the end of our episode, and it's time for our favorite moments. I just had two short ones. One of the funny things that happened was when they're at Dragonstone and Daemon and Criston Cole have some words, and Damon's basically like, who are you? Why are you here? And then he calls him Sir Crispin to try to offend him. And then Criston Cole responds with, perhaps my prince recalls that I knocked him off his horse.
Yes, that's a great one. Yes.
And I was like, all right, fair point. You right, Criston. That's true. And then obviously my other favorite moment was just Rhaenyra arriving on Syrax to be like, I'm here to solve the problem that you guys can't solve. She has one quick and easy conversation and she gets the egg back. No problem. No bloodshed. So
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite scenes. I put the entire scene with Hightower, Rhaenyra. There's just so much tension when they all draw their swords and you're like, oh shit, it's about to go down. And then when you see the clouds kind of part and then she just fucking comes out of there on dragonback and it's just so epic. Also part of that scene, I just love when Daemon and Rhaenyra have conversations in Old Valyrian. There's just something about those scenes that there's just this really delicious tension and not romantic intimacy, but intimacy, and just they're very frank with each other. There's a realness there, and I love that. So that was one of my favorite scenes too. And then I also just loved when Alicent and Rhaenyra were in the sept together. I just like seeing their friendship and them being vulnerable with each other because they're really both just two very young girls who've lost their mothers, who've experienced a trauma, and just, grieving that and trying to navigate their way in this complicated and weird world that they live in. And then my very last one was at the end when Daemon is talking to Lord Corlys and he says, "It was never my brother's strongest trait." And Lord Corlys says, "What?" And Daemon says, "Being king." Being king. And I was like, damn, that's a sick word. I was like, woo. I was like, I felt the flames coming off of that, man. That hurt.
Yeah.
That stung.
All right. And there you guys have it.
There you have it.
That is the end of our podcast episode today. Thank you guys all so much for joining us for another episode of the Booked on Fantasy podcast. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review, or share it with all your friends who love fantasy as well. If you would like to keep up with us on other platforms, then all of our socials are linked below. And yeah, that's all we have for you guys today. So as usual, stay nerdy, everyone, and we'll catch you all next week for House of the Dragon episode 3.
Woo!
Yay.
Bye.
I'm a fidgety person, as we know.
What? Not me editing you, and I'm like, God damn it, Lorraine, quit moving.
Like,
okay. I like all your hand emotions. Simultaneously, David starts his shenanigans. He steals a dragon. Oh my god. I'm gonna scrape. God. What the fuck? Why does my voice sound like that? I don't know what to do.